Ladies and gentlemen, the next session, Leading with Civility, is sponsored by Motor City Casino Hotel. Please welcome Chief of Police for the Detroit Police Department, James Craig.
Good morning. Good afternoon. I was hoping to get a better applause than that, but I guess, thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, I certainly want to acknowledge the Detroit Regional Policy Conference and the chairs. Certainly a friend of mine, Huell Perkins, who is really, I'm going to talk a little bit about the media in my conversation, but Huell Perkins, Devin, certainly have been just consummate professionals in the way they do their job. And I certainly want to also acknowledge Dr. Vitti, who will be joining me shortly. So when we think about civility, you know, one of the things is real key for me as a police chief, and certainly working in the city, is building trust in our neighborhoods. Building trust in our neighborhoods. And I would tell you, historically, the department has done a good job with that. There was some erosion at one point. I will tell you that when I first arrived here in July of 2013, the community had lost trust in this department. There are a number of factors. Homicide clearance rate, 11%. Response times, over an hour. A continuing soaring crime rate. Those things caused a loss of trust in this police agency. And then it was the men and women doing the tough work who had lost trust in their leadership. So their morale, like the community, was at the very bottom. So I want to talk briefly about what I was met with. There was a news story shortly after I arrived. But in April of 2013, there was an officer by the name of Patrick Hill, affectionately referred to as Wolverine. He was working in a surveillance violent crime unit, and on this fatal day, he was going after a murder suspect. And it was during that going after the murder suspect that he and his team members, it ended in a violent shootout between the suspect and the officers. Patrick Hill was shot. And so when I arrived in 2013 of July, I went to the hospital room to see him. And as I began to look at the circumstances surrounding this, I found out that we shot him. We shot him. The tactics were horrible. We created a crossfire situation. The former administration refused to tell the public what happened. But I did. And I met with his wife, who still is actively working with us, Diage Hill, and I called her, or met with her in person, and said, it was our gunfire that struck your husband. And so, telling the truth, being transparent, you know, leaders talk a lot about being transparent, but it's what you do every day. Is it easy to say we shot our officer? But it's not a if, it's a we shall do it, because the public, the community expects it, they demand it. Many of our officers didn't even know that this officer was shot by friendly fire. And then I'll take you back at a time when I was the police chief in Cincinnati. In August of 2011, a 16-year-old was shot and killed by Cincinnati police officers. There was a festive event. There were reports of young people coming into this event with guns. There was a foot chase. One officer who happened to be a white officer, and the subject, 16-year-old African-American male, was being chased. And during the chase, where the chase ended, there was a struggle. The subject, 16 years old, had a gun, and there was a struggle over the gun. At some point, the officer, fearing for his life, used deadly force. As you can imagine, the city was up in arms because Cincinnati had had a history some years back where 15 African-American men were shot by Cincinnati police officers. And from that, there was a civil unrest, community contract, and then a consent judgment that lasted around 7 or 8 years. But in response to this shooting incident, In 24 hours, the mayor, myself, and the city manager, we stood together on stage, and we reported the facts out as we knew. I also invited the family, his mom, his cousins, friends of the family, to come into police headquarters and see the video. And ultimately, the response was very different. And then there was another incident in Cincinnati where a young man was armed with a gun. Cincinnati police officers approached. They ordered him to drop the gun. He did. He ingested large amount of narcotics. He was immediately rushed to the hospital by a rescue ambulance. But at the scene was a reporter. Within minutes, there was a story online. Cincinnati police officers fatally shoot young African-American man. That story was false. It was a lie. My phone began to ring. Certainly the story was taken down and the truth was told. But when you talk about civility, especially in today's environment, people do what? They react. And they did. So let's talk about recent events here in Detroit. Chief of Police says, arm all teachers. In other words, as teachers come in to get their lesson plans, give them a pistol and lesson plans and go to work. Far-fetched, outrageous, ridiculous, and untrue. So what happened in Florida should not have happened. So we're all seeking solutions. And one, not so, was that as a police chief who's been a practitioner in this work now for 40 plus years, said one option, and not the sole option, is maybe we look at former military veterans, former police officers who are well-trained. We do rigorous background on them. We create a training scenario that fits the school environment as one option. And let's not talk about, and many of you probably have heard me talk about the mentally ill, because there's a nexus. We have failed those suffering from the mental illness. We put a Band-Aid on it and say, go away. We've transferred our response as a society from mental health professionals to the criminal justice system. This is why we have 70 to 80% of those suffering from mental illness in jail. They're not being treated in jail. But when they go in for their 72-hour evaluation, they're out, and guess what? We're confronted again. So that was the second tier. Then communication. Now that we look at Florida, how many flags went up that this young man was suffering? How many contacts with local law enforcement? 40 to 80? Even if it was just 40, I think it's more like 80. Do you think when the young man went to buy a gun that there could have been a connection to that information that would prohibit him from buying a firearm? I think so. And then we always preach, see something, say something. See something, say something. Well, people did see something, they did say something, and law enforcement failed them. That's the truth. And so when we talk about civility, we're always looking for solutions. Post 9/11, the Tactical Flight Officer Program came into existence. Pilots could carry weapons. Not all pilots, select pilots. Maybe they have military background. They got specific training to deal with a threat inside of an airplane. And then on top of that, they layered an extra layer of security, which was the air marshals, who were also armed. And it worked. Israel, 1974, terrorists entered into a school, killing many children. In response, what they did was give special training to some teachers. And from 74 to present, after that, 2 shooting incidents involving someone entering a school with a gun. And it was armed teachers who mitigated the threat. And so lastly, as I close out, so we talk about civility. Chief says arm every teacher. Not true. But instead of having dialogue and conversation, you have those who sit in social media chat rooms who become very unproductive, unprofessional, argumentative, and begin to attack without knowing all the facts. One such person, a school board member. Another person, an elected state legislator. But you know what's interesting about folks that sit in those seats? First, I want to applaud the governor, the mayor, city council, because it's no secret that I faced with a number of tragedies in the Detroit Police Department, and they reached out in support. But these same people that attacked me with not having all the information, and some of them who remain silent, who sit U.S. House of Representatives or senators, state representatives, quiet. That's a problem. This is the order of the day, and we can't have civil discussion unless we open those doors where we can understand and seek meaning. With that, I close out and say thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Superintendent of Detroit Public Schools Community District, Nikolai Vitti.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference and have this conversation about civility. There's so much to talk about when you're thinking about civility, and in going into this opportunity to speak on the topic, I was trying to decide what angle to take, and hopefully I've landed in the right place and you gained something from this conversation. So civility, in many ways, when we think about it, it's the genteelness, the respect that should be part of a public discourse among leaders in any city, statewide, nationally. And certainly there's an importance to thinking about your role as a public leader in a civil way. But I do want to challenge that notion a little bit and talk about what that means for us as a school district, especially a school district that is in the rebuilding stages. So often I hear the term uncivil when individuals push back, or uncivil when people speak out, when people challenge authority. And often that term is used to silence opposition and criticism. And I've seen that often happen in public education, whether it be in New York, Miami, Jacksonville, the Boston area, places in North Carolina, all of which I've worked in. And when you think about being a public servant, taking that type of approach is the opposite, I think, of trying to create a school district that truly is reflective of its community, and the citizens are part of it. Too often we, I think, in public education and leadership in general, look at how people express themselves, the manner in which they do that, and often that is a way to ignore issues of class and educational opportunity, class defined by socioeconomic opportunities. I think there's also issues that we forget to take note of regarding how we speak differently based on race, ethnicity, cultural background, language. So when you go about leading a public school system, whether it be Detroit or any large urban school districts throughout the country, you have to be cognizant and respectful that everyone is not going to engage in the public discourse the same way. So as a leader here in Detroit, I try to always ask myself, not trying to listen at how people say things, but what are they saying? And I think that is something that's lost, certainly based on what we're seeing nationally as far as leadership is concerned, but it's something that I think is lost in K-12 education often, is do we have the opportunity to empathize? And empathy is hard, more likely to be able to try to sympathize with individuals, but are we truly trying to be empathetic and sympathetic, and do we really try to listen? Not, again, at how things are said, but what is being said. And do we really rethink our strategy and our approach based on what is being said that may challenge our initial notion of what reform looks like or what the strategy looks like? And when we don't truly listen and we don't try to be sympathetic or empathetic to the message, we actually take people out of the equation of the reform. And we think that we will change things and reform systems and processes singularly through an individual or a team, not trying to build a collective movement around the reform. And I think that has crippled reform throughout this country, and crippled reform especially in K-12 public education. So what I have tried to do as a leader is always surround myself with difference. Surround myself with diversity, not diversity only in the name of race, ethnicity, but difference of opinion, diversity of ideas and experiences, because you create a team where there's constant dialogue, disagreement, and engagement to create a collective understanding of the work that's truly more reflective of the individuals, families, parents that you're trying to serve, which creates a stronger reform platform and overall strategy. Here in this work, I've been fortunate to bring people from Florida with me, individuals I worked with or I recruited from Miami and Jacksonville. I've also been able to keep people on the team that were originally part of the Detroit leadership team and take individuals from Detroit that were on the fringes of supporting public education but would never actually get in the fray because they were just skeptical that leadership could actually change the district or their voice would be heard. So those three groups have been formed to create a synergy of ideas to transform this district. And I would urge all of you and anyone listening or even thinking about this topic is, are you building a team and are you surrounding yourself with individuals that truly challenge your assumptions, challenges your notions of whatever it is you're going about to reform or change? And are you creating mechanisms and opportunities to truly hear people? We often see politicians, political leaders, and leaders say they're listening. But are they really listening, or are they checking the box in order to say, I did an engagement session and I did listen? Listening is beyond just sitting there not talking. Listening is actually reflecting and thinking about what was said versus what you said or what you think, and incorporating that opposition to the overall reform so it becomes something more than just your own or your own individual team's reform. Here in Detroit, after 8 months of just starting the rebuilding process of the district, what you see behind me is our Blueprint 2020, which is our strategic plan for rebuilding the school district. And so you see the mission, the vision, the core values, and priorities. And starting this process, there's probably very little on this screen that I disagreed with or that I didn't necessarily think about in coming into the district. But to create this Blueprint 2020, we engaged hundreds of parents, teachers, principals, district staff and asked three questions: what's working, what's not, and what do we need to do differently? And in creating this Blueprint 2020, it was clear that I could have sat in a room and wrote this myself, worked just with the school board, and just moved forward and said, this is our blueprint moving forward. But because we had these engagement sessions, it led to, I believe, a stronger shared ownership of what reform will look like as we try to rebuild this district. I think as you look at the Blueprint 2020, you also see elements that I just talked about. So you see, for example, service. The concept of service is that we are public servant. I am a public servant. I am here to serve parents, communities, employees. It's not about me, it's about us. It's about truly listening to the voices of individuals that unfortunately have not been heard under emergency management, listening to that voice and creating action and change and strategy behind that voice. Part of that work is students first. I always say we can always disagree on the issue, but at the center of the work will be children, will be students. And so how do we all collectively move to a place of agreeing that it's about kids? We can disagree maybe about the strategy, but how do we come together in unity to do things differently and better for children? You also see transformative culture. listed there. And so transformative culture is actually being responsive. So we've had a number of community meetings. I know board member Misha Stallworth will speak after I do later in a later session. And what is different about our school district is we have an elected board. For the first time, an elected empowered board for the first time over a decade. And some people don't really understand how important that is when you're running a district like we do and you have many, many complications and challenges, if you don't have individuals at the local level that are responsible for listening to everyday people's issues or needs, they can simply be ignored or pushed to the side. And frankly, under emergency management, that happened. And so who is really responsible for a bad business deal? Who's responsible for an incompetent principal or issues at a school level that was never detected or exposed or investigated? No one. When you have individuals far removed from Detroit that were running the school district. Again, that's not a political statement, it's a reality of operating a system that should be responsive to everyday citizens and people. So what we do now is many community meetings where we're talking about the reform, gating feedback, and then incorporating that into our way of work. As leaders, we should never be afraid to listen to the opposition, and I'm going to continue to repeat that. That is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength to be able to stand up in front of a community without prepackaged questions, with an open mic, and you have to stand up and explain the decision you made and be willing to say, I made a mistake in that decision, and I'm willing to rethink that and adjust that. Not the political relations effort of just simply listening without responding. The other thing that we've incorporated is something called Chat with the Sup, or Chat with the Superintendent, where I have open forums with students, with parents, with our principals, assistant principals, teachers, and again, I ask 3 questions. What's working, what's not, and what can we do differently? And that creates, again, a collective ownership for a vision that is shared as we move forward with doing this work. And so, in summary, be transparent, be engaged, listen, reflect, and be willing to bring people on your team that can be sympathetic and, most importantly, empathetic to the people that you're serving, so the overall reform can truly be a voice of everyone you're serving, not just your perspective or your vision of what that reform looks like. I know many of you are probably hungry to hear more about armed teachers in schools, so I'll let the panel discussion facilitate that conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Please welcome back to the stage Chief of Police for the Detroit Police Department, James Craig. And to lead the discussion, anchor for WJBK Fox 2, Huel Perkins.
Well, thank you very much. We are going to, whatever you want to say.
That was far away.
That's fine. We're going to let it rip here. And the discussion is going to be frank, open, and honest, but I am so proud and happy to be with 2 dynamic leaders. They share a common bond. They are both native sons of this region, and they are both deeply concerned about the safety and protection of students. But in a world in which mass shootings happen far too frequently, how best do we accomplish that goal? Protecting students and making sure they're safe. Dr. Vitti, you've heard Chief Craig mention the possibility of arming some teachers. Your response?
Sure. So we talked about this off stage, but I think it's important for everyone to hear. I have a deep respect for Chief Craig and his work. Personally, professionally, I can only imagine what he goes through, and I'm sure he can actually use the word empathize with what I go through to some level. So this has actually been, over the past couple of days, a good example of civility, where we obviously disagree on an issue, but you haven't seen press conferences run by myself or the school board denouncing the perspective that the chief had. But instead, we gave a statement clearly delineating our perspective on the issue. And here we are with you openly talking about the issue. Whether it's Detroiters or citizens in general, they don't want adults and leaders to fight. They actually want adults and leaders to speak about issues, have an intelligent, logical discourse, Agree to disagree, make compromises when necessary, but take action and move on. And I think we've demonstrated that. So specifically to the issue, you know, on this issue, if you actually listen to teachers and you listen to students and parents, the vast majority, not 51 out of 49%, but the vast majority want to see less guns in schools than more. And so in Detroit, we have armed officers in our secondary schools that are trained officers that are positioned in our secondary schools to prevent an incident that occurred in Florida from happening, and also to deal with other violent issues that may trickle into the school from the greater community. Our position is that when you add more guns to an environment, you increase the likelihood that they're used, even if those that have the guns are trained, if it would be teachers or principals, etc. Teachers, principals are there to educate children, not necessarily to prevent a mass shooting scenario from happening. To address the issue, school districts have to be more vigilant about systems that need to be put in place with single access to a single entry to schools, a check-in process. You have to have people monitoring social media to detect these issues when they come up. The best metal detector is relationships with children. When you're talking about parents actively talking to guidance counselors, teachers, talking to students, students talking to other students and reporting when these incidents happen, expansion of mental health detection, but lastly, gun control. What we're not talking about as a country is that mass shootings do not happen across the world, and they're happening in the United States. And every country is dealing with mental health. Every country is dealing with youth that is alienated. Every country deals with violent adolescents. The difference in our country is the easy access to weapons. And I say not guns, weapons. Weapons are created to kill people. Weapons are given to soldiers to fight in wars. Why in the world in this country are we in any way allowing weapons to fall in the hands of children? And I would say adults in general, but especially children. That's the conversation that we're not having.
Meanwhile, Chief, you have said for years that good people who are armed have not only the right but the obligation to protect themselves. And that in some cases, an armed citizen can be a force for good. Do you still believe that in light of what's happened?
Absolutely. You know, I steadfastly take that position. I know there's a lot of conversation surrounding gun control, but we don't talk about crime control. How do we keep guns out of the hands of criminals? And how we do that, when we arrest, there's got to be a certainty of prosecution. There has to be a deterrent. Oftentimes I've been heard saying, well, in Macomb and Oakland counties, suspects have said it. They've said it to our officers. If I want to carry a gun, I don't want to carry it in Oakland or Macomb County. Why is that? Question one. But when you talk about a trained, responsible citizen, can it have an impact on reducing violence? I say absolutely yes, it does. And I wish I could sit here and tell you we live in an environment today that we had no need to worry about mass shootings. Factually, it's happening. The mental illness, I've been talking a lot about that, and I agree in part, a large part with Dr. Vitti. That's a broken system. If we could fix that, maybe we wouldn't have to worry so much. But we still have the issue of violence. And to say that we're going to control guns and not criminals, that's problematic. We ask ourselves, how come we've seen a steady increase in violence over the years? Wayne County is one of the leading counties in the country that citizens in this city have concealed pistol license. I believe, in part, that's been a reason why we've seen a reduction in violence. Because when I first arrived here, the thing that was so odd for me, having worked in a number of different cities, is that suspects would wear body armor, and sometimes they would make victims disrobe because they were fearful that they were going to encounter an armed citizen. And yes, that acts as a deterrent. Again, in a perfect world, we would hope we would not have to make that adjustment. We wouldn't have to worry about, I was reading something earlier about schools being safe havens, and there's no place for teachers to have guns. I wish I could look you in the face and say schools are safe havens. Parkland, Florida is a safe haven. Per capita crime is probably some of the lowest in this country. But tragedy struck. Las Vegas, people out enjoying a night at a concert. Police officers off duty not allowed to carry their sidearms into the venue. Tragedy strikes. The NFL has made a statement that off-duty police officers shouldn't carry in stadiums. Unfortunately, our time is different. And we have to be about the business of protecting each other.
Could I?
Go.
Yeah. So we don't have teachers in England. We don't have teachers anywhere across the country, or the world, I should say, that carry guns to school. And so let's look at cause and effect. We don't have mass shootings in other places around the world because teachers are armed in the classroom. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
It's a cultural thing.
Right. So, well, it's not a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing that we have an obsession with guns in the United States. Yes, that is cultural. But there's a way to embrace that culture where guns are used as a hobby, where you go to a place, and this is becoming a conversation about gun control because we have to have that conversation, and I feel I have to have that conversation because that type of violence is spilling into our schools. Schools don't make neighborhoods safe. Safe neighborhoods make schools safe. And so I do disagree with the fact that our schools are largely safe havens. They're not completely safe. I'm not going to be naive and tell you that. But our children in Detroit often feel more safe in school than they do in their own home or in the larger community. And one reason for that is guns are not in school. And so I see, as a former teacher, principal in some of the toughest cities and school districts throughout the country, I have seen where a conversation or an interaction between a teacher and a student begins to be escalated because of misunderstanding around race, around ethnicity, around language, around body movement. That has escalated to suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, even violent interactions between faculty and staff. Do we want to add a gun to that possible equation? That's just an honest, serious issue that we have to deal with. And I don't know how we get to a place in society where we say we're going to combat violence with more violence, or we're going to combat violence with the possibility of more violence. I mean, are we really creating a scenario where he has a gun, so I need a gun? Are we creating a scenario where because there might be a gun on the outside, more teachers need guns? It just feels like that's the logic being used, and I don't know if we're ever going to create a scenario where, I mean, is it to a point where we all need to walk around now with a gun? It just seems like that only offers more of an opportunity to take a volatile situation and link it to gun violence rather than creating a volatile situation that could move into a violent situation without guns.
Well, let me just follow up, and I understand your point in an empathetic way, but I will tell you that I was watching Let It Rip, Cass Tech sophomore, I think she was a sophomore. She made one statement, and even though she certainly didn't support more guns in school, but what she did say, I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. So now I'm going to give you a real live situation. 1974, Israel. There was a terrorist suspects entered into a school and murdered lots of children, school administrators. Israel reacted to that tragedy. And what Israel did, they said, we're going to train some teachers in firearms. We're going to make sure we have armed guards in each school. They did that. 74 up to present, there have been 2 shooting incidents in schools. And in both incidents, suspects entered the school armed, and it was an armed teacher that mitigated that threat. So when you look across the country, there are other school systems that are saying, you know what, the right teacher, and when I talk about teachers, believe me, there's teachers with CPLs that I know that I wouldn't want to see them in school performing that function. But when I think about a U.S. Marine, somebody who's well-trained, a former police officer, well-trained, going through a rigorous background check to ensure there's no mental issues, but in addition to that, getting some significant training on how to mitigate a threat in a school environment, that to me seems reasonable, particularly in those schools where they may not have an armed security guard or an armed police officer. That's all I'm saying. Just an extra layer of security, and I compare it, as I indicated in my earlier remarks, to the tactical flight officer. Not every pilot is armed. Select pilots are armed, and sometimes in addition to the pilot being armed, there may be an armed air marshal. And then on top of that, it might be a federal agent, or it might be Chief Craig who's armed on the flight. And we know who's armed on that flight. And it's unfortunate that we have to harden the targets. Yesterday, the 11th Precinct did a training exercise for ministers for dealing with active shooter situations in churches. There was a time in the wildest dream we would never believe that we would have to think about going to church and being protected. But that's the environment we're in today.
Possibly there is no one solution. Maybe you have to try many things. You certainly have to look at the mental health component. You also have to look at what our kids are doing online. Even today, there are 2 school systems that have been either completely or partially shut down because of online threats posted by students. So what then is the role of educators, administrators, police, and parents, in calming these kids down, in addressing the problem before there is violence?
Hugh, that's a great comment. I just got to say that in the last, since Parkland, we have handled so many threats in school. Mm-hmm. One such threat, the individual threatened to do a shooting. The department responded correctly, found out that the person lived in a suburb community, but he was sending the threat from a computer in Detroit. We responded, we arrested him. It's an issue, and God forbid that it happens, or that we as an agency don't respond and we're not working collaboratively with DPS to make sure we can address these threats, but it's happening.
So, Chief used an example in Israel. I'm going to very quickly. 1996, we had another situation in Scotland where we had a mass shooting. Citizens in Scotland linked to the United Kingdom rallied to say this can't happen again. And gun control was initiated in the United Kingdom and England as a whole. No mass shooting since. I'm not suggesting that it's that simple, but likewise, arming officers in Israel and using that example as a deterrent also is not as simple either. So I think we have to look at national examples on both cases. The social media issue is real. We have enhanced more personnel to look and monitor social media. I think our principals, assistant principals, deans, teachers are more aware of what's happening in social media. We do have to work more together, I think, with Detroit Police Department. I already see in the last week more connectivity between the federal government and the school districts. I know ours. We've seen more communication in the last week about threats on social media. That's a step in the right direction. I think Chief made a great point in his opening remarks about the fact of sharing data. Sharing data, which is in 2018, that shouldn't be an issue. That's just about the right people getting in the right room, making the right commitments, the right MOUs to say what the department knows, we know, what we have, they know, what the federal government has, they know, and that has to also obviously be linked to a gun registry process.
And look, and that is the beginning. We are out of time, but I thank you both for your comments and your insights. To quote Senator Carl Levin, there can be no solution without a desire to find one. And I think having both of you sitting down in this room and collectively working together, somehow, some way, we will solve this problem.
Thank you, sir.
Chief.
Yep, thank you all.
Vitti, thank you both.
All right.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is The Power of Placemaking. Please welcome the President and Chief Executive Officer for the Detroit Riverfront